at 14,000 feet over Rabble Harbor on November 7, 1943. Aviation machinist mate First Class Richard Parker gripped the twin, 50 caliber machine gun handles, tracking a Japanese Zero diving toward his Corsair from the same angle that had killed 3 rear gunners in his squadron over the past 6 weeks. 24 years old, with 8 months as a rear gunner and 17 combat encounters, he had yet to score a confirmed kill. The Japanese had launched 32 Zeros that morning to intercept the American bomber formation over Rabble. The first rear gunner Parker replaced was aviation machinist mate Second Class David Martinez on September 14, 1943. Martinez followed the manual exactly, aiming directly at the attacking Zeros and leading them by half a wingspan, as taught at Pensacola. His tracers always fell short. A Zero approached from 9 o'clock level. Martinez fired 4 bursts using the proper deflection method. All 4 missed. The Zero's 20mm cannon rounds pierced the Corsair's fuel tank. Martinez died instantly, before his pilot could respond. The second was aviation machinist mate Third Class Tommy Wilson on October 3. Wilson tried modifying the technique himself, leading targets by 2 wings instead of half. Still, his rounds went wide. He watched his tracers streak into empty sky behind every Zero attacking. On a head-on pass, Wilson fired frantically. The Zero pilot, knowing Wilson couldn't hit him, pressed the attack to 200 yards. Cannon fire shredded the Corsair's engine. Wilson's plane went down, trailing smoke. His body never recovered. Aviation machinist mate Second Class James Coe died on October 27. Same story, perfect technique. Ideal form. No kills until an uncatchable Zero struck. By early November, Parker's squadron had lost 8 rear gunners in 6 weeks. The deflection shooting method taught at Pensacola was failing. Every gunner recognized it, yet they persisted, lacking alternatives. Now, a Zero dove toward Parker from 11 o'clock high, 300 yards out, closing at over 400 miles per hour combined. Parker's training said, aim directly at the target, lead slightly, squeeze the trigger when the sight fills. Standard deflection shooting. Every Navy gunner learns this. Parker ignored it. He aimed 8 aircraft lengths ahead of the Zero, not at it. Not slightly ahead, but 8 full lengths into empty air. Trusting that this was the only way to survive the next 10 seconds, Lieutenant James Morrison pulled the Corsair into a sharp left bank. G-forces pressed Parker into his seat. His arms felt like 40 pounds each. The gun sight vibrated against his eye. The Zero moved across his vision so fast that standard aiming was impossible. Parker squeezed both triggers. The twin 50s roared, 500 rounds per minute combined. The sound was deafening, even through his leather helmet. Hot brass casings flew past his face. Cordite filled the cramped gunner position. Tracers arced forward in a stream that seemed destined to miss. The Zero flew directly into Parker's bullet path, not where he initially aimed, but where the rounds would be 3 seconds later. When the Zero reached that point, metal tore through the Zero's engine cowling. The propeller disintegrated. Black smoke erupted. The Zero rolled inverted, spiraling toward the ocean for miles below. Morrison's voice crackled over the intercom. What the hell kind of shooting was that? Parker didn't answer immediately. His hands shook not from fear, but from realizing he'd just done something that contradicted every hour of gunnery training. He had aimed at a point in space where the target would be, and it had worked. The Corsair continued its patrol over Rabble, covering American bombers striking the harbor and airfields below. More Zeros were inbound, and Parker would have to decide whether to trust his training or trust his newfound method. 3 minutes later, 2 more Zeros appeared at 10 o'clock level. Morrison spotted them. Parker rotated his gun. Standard Navy procedure: aim at the aircraft. Lead by half a wingspan per 100 knots of crossing speed. Simple, easy to remember, utterly ineffective against maneuvering targets from a turning platform. Parker calculated differently. The Zeros closed at roughly 200 knots combined. His bullets would take 1 second to reach effective range. He aimed 10 aircraft lengths ahead. Into empty sky. He fired. The 50s thundered. Tracers reached the lead Zero, hitting exactly as predicted. The cockpit canopy shattered. The Zero nosed down, trailing smoke. The second Zero broke right, disappearing into clouds. Morrison spoke over the intercom, disbelief in his tone. "You're not aiming at them." "No, sir," Parker replied. "I'm aiming at where they're going to be, not where they are. That's not what they taught us at Pensacola." "I know, sir." Morrison was silent for 5 seconds, then said words Parker would remember forever. "Keep doing it." Over the next 40 minutes, Parker scored 3 more firing opportunities, leading the targets by what seemed impossible. 2 more Zeros went down. 1 broke off smoking. Morrison returned the Corsair to the carrier, battered by bullets. With a gunner who had unknowingly rewritten the rules of aerial deflection shooting, what Parker didn't know, the method worked because the traditional deflection doctrine failed against maneuverable Japanese Zeros. The 1942 Navy Gunnery Manual devoted 12 pages to deflection shooting, with diagrams, tables, and formulas perfect on paper, catastrophic in combat. Zeros could turn tighter, climb and dive fast reverse direction in under 4 seconds. American gunners trained on pre-war methods assumed straight flight paths. That assumption killed men. From December 1941 to October 1943, over 800 U.S. aircraft were lost to Japanese fighters. Rear gunners like Parker had to calculate both their platform's movement and the target's maneuvers while subjected to G-forces and vibration, all while firing limited ammunition 150 rounds total for both. 50s. Sounds like a lot until you calculate fire time. At 500 rounds per minute combined, that's 3 minutes of continuous firing. But no gunner fired continuously. You fired in short bursts, Twoscon bursts, to conserve ammunition and prevent the barrels from overheating. Each burst used roughly 16 rounds total, which meant a Corsair rear gunner had about 90 bursts available for an entire mission. If you missed with the first burst, you got a second chance, maybe a third, and then the target was gone or you were out of position. Combat missions over Rabaul typically lasted 2 hours, multiple encounters, multiple enemies. Gunners had to make every burst count. But when the deflection method didn't work, making bursts count was impossible. The Japanese understood American deflection shooting weaknesses. Zero pilots were trained to exploit them. The tactic was straightforward. When an American gunner opened fire, brake sharply in any direction. The American would aim where you had been. By the time the bullets arrived, you'd be somewhere else, then reverse and attack from a new angle. American gunners called it the Zero Dance, a sequence of erratic turns that made deflection fire almost useless. Statistics from the first year of the Pacific War were bleak. Rear gunners scored confirmed kills on only about 6% of firing chances. That meant 94% of the time the ammunition was wasted. The Zero escaped, and the bomber or fighter stayed vulnerable. Squadron commanders knew the numbers. They knew the doctrine wasn't working, but there was no alternative. The Navy had spent years developing the deflection shooting system. It was backed by calculations, testing, and instructors at Pensacola who had never been shot at by a Zero pilot. Parker had been a rear gunner for 8 months when the Rabaul mission happened. He'd fired at Japanese aircraft 17 times in earlier engagements. He'd recorded 0 confirmed kills not because he was a poor shot, but because he was following the manual, aiming where the target was, adding the required lead, watching his tracers whip past behind the enemy every time, watching the Zeros twist away and escape. On November 7th, something changed. Parker stopped, following the handbook. He aimed at a point that seemed wrong, that looked wrong, that contradicted every hour of training he'd received, and the Zero flew directly into his bullets. What made this even stranger was that Parker couldn't clearly explain why he'd done it. Parker's issue wasn't unique. It was widespread across the Pacific theater. Every rear gunner in every squadron faced the same problem. The deflection shooting doctrine assumed rational, predictable enemy behavior. Japanese pilots didn't behave predictably. They flew aggressively, erratically, and with a willingness to press attacks that American tacticians hadn't anticipated. The mental calculation for standard deflection fire took about 2 seconds. Estimate target speed. estimate crossing angle, compute lead, adjust aim, fire. 2 seconds. Sounds fast. Until you're in combat. A Zero moving 300 miles per hour covers almost 900 feet in 2 seconds, nearly 3 football fields. By the time a gunner finished the calculation and fired, the target was already far from where he'd aimed. The Navy tried to fix this with more training. At Pensacola, gunners spent hours shooting at towed targets' fabric sleeves, pulled by aircraft flying neat, predictable paths. Gunners who scored perfectly on the range arrived in the Pacific and discovered that Japanese pilots did not fly like cooperative towed sleeves. They learned that hitting a twisting, maneuvering aircraft was a completely different challenge. Some squadrons tried leading targets by larger distances. If the manual said half a wingspan, some tried 2 wingspans. Still, didn't work. The problem wasn't the amount of lead, it was that any lead calculation based on where the target currently was became obsolete by the time bullets reached that place. Zero pilots understood this and exploited it mercilessly. Other squadrons tried saturation fire, filling the air with bullets and hoping the enemy flew through them. This burned through ammunition alarmingly fast. A Corsair gunner who emptied his ammo in the first 10 minutes of a mission was useless for the next hour and a half. And saturation fire still didn't fix the core issue. Random bullet spread gave hit probabilities around 2% worse than aimed fire with the flawed doctrine. The psychological strain on gunners was enormous. Your job was to defend the aircraft, protect the pilot, shoot down attackers before they got you. But your training didn't work. Your manual didn't work. You watched tracers miss. You watched Zeros slip away. You watched friendly aircraft go down because their gunners couldn't hit anything either. Parker felt this pressure firsthand. On his 4th combat mission in July 1943, a Zero made a stern attack on his Corsair. Parker fired 3 bursts using proper deflection technique. All 3 missed. The Zero's cannon rounds smashed through the left wing and into the fuel tank. Morrison barely coaxed the aircraft back to the carrier on one engine. After landing, Morrison didn't say anything. He didn't have to. Parker knew he'd failed. That failure stayed with him for 4 months, every mission, every engagement, following the manual, missing every time, watching Zeros dance through his fire. The worst part was knowing other gunners were having the same experience. It wasn't personal incompetence. It was a systemic flaw. But knowing that didn't make the bullets hit. The Navy's official response to poor gunnery results was more training and more discipline, reinforcing proper deflection technique, emphasizing adherence to procedure. What they didn't acknowledge was that the procedures themselves were flawed, built on assumptions that didn't match how combat actually unfolded. Some gunners began developing their own techniques, leading by instinct instead of calculation. Most attempts failed. A few seemed promising, but the gunners couldn't explain what they were doing differently. Parker's discovery on November 7th was different. It wasn't instinct. It wasn't random. It was a specific, reproducible technique that worked immediately. He aimed 8 to 12 aircraft lengths ahead. Bullets and target met perfectly 3 times in one mission, but Parker still didn't know whether he could repeat it. The Zero had moved another 50 ft. Parker wasn't consciously calculating these delays. He was estimating them through repeated observation. He'd watched enough tracers miss, watched enough Zeros dance away from his fire. His brain had started predicting not where the Zero was going, but where it would be after all the delays stacked up. That prediction was what made theme thought work. The third factor was Japanese pilot behavior. Zero pilots were trained to be aggressive. When they saw an American formation, they attacked. They closed the gap rapidly. They maneuvered sharply, but predictably within certain limits. A diving Zero would continue its dive for at least 2 seconds before leveling out. A turning Zero would maintain its arc for at least 1 complete rotation. These patterns were exploitable if you could anticipate them. American pilots called it reading the engagement. Seasoned gunners developed an instinct for what a Zero pilot would do next based on its current movement. Parker possessed that instinct. He just hadn't realized how to apply it until November 7th. Once he grasped that he needed to aim at the future location rather than the present location, His intuition became a weapon. The physics were straightforward once understood. If a target is moving at velocity x and your bullet travels at velocity y, and the engagement distance is z, you calculate where the target will be at time z divided by y and aim at that point. The Navy manual acknowledged this, but its formulas assumed linear flight and overlooked human delays. Parker's approach accounted for reality rather than theory. Temperature and altitude slightly influenced bullet velocity. Wind altered trajectory. The Corsair's own motion added complexity, but these variables were minor compared to the major error in the conventional deflection method. Even if Parker's estimates were off by 10%, he was still striking roughly 70 feet closer to the target than a gunner following the manual. The technique had one significant limitation. It demanded the gunner make immediate assessments of target speed, angle, and future position. No time for careful computation. No time to consult tables or formulas. The gunner had to observe a zero and instantly know where to aim. That kind of shooting couldn't be taught from a manual. It had to be learned through experience, by observing how zeros moved, developing the instinct that separated competent gunners from lethal ones. Parker had spent 8 months missing before he figured it out. 8 months of studying patterns. 8 months of noting where his tracers landed versus where the zeros were. All that failure had instructed him on what success required. He just hadn't realized it until he aimed at empty sky and watched a zero fly into his rounds. But survival required more than one gunner employing an improved method. The first person Parker instructed was aviation machinist's mate second class Tommy Chen, another rear gunner in the squadron. Chen had been firing at zeros for 6 months without a confirmed kill. He was frustrated and felt inadequate. The night after Parker's second successful mission, they were in the ready room aboard the carrier. Chen asked how Parker was suddenly landing hits. Parker explained the method. Aim far ahead. Not at the zero, at where it will be. Chen looked doubtful, said it seemed impossible. Parker took him to the flight deck after dark and demonstrated with his hands. The zero is here now. Your rounds need 1 second to arrive. In 1 second, at 300 miles per hour, the zero travels this distance. Aim here. Chen stared at the empty space Parker indicated. That's like aiming at nothing. That's exactly right, Parker said. Aim at empty sky and trust the math. Chen flew his next mission 2 days later, November 13th, escorting Raboul again. Using Parker's method, he achieved his first confirmed kill, a zero that flew directly into his bullet stream, precisely where Chen had aimed. Upon landing, he found Parker and said simply, "It actually works." Word spread through the squadron faster than official orders ever could. Gunner to gunner, during missions, in the ready room, on the flight deck during maintenance. Parker became an unofficial instructor, sketching diagrams on scrap paper, gesturing distances, explaining how to estimate where a zero would be based on its speed and heading. Not everyone was convinced. Aviation machinist, mate, first class. Robert Hayes said it contradicted everything he'd learned at Pensacola. He argued that the Navy couldn't teach incorrect methods. Parker showed him the statistics: 6% hit rate with the manual, 60% with the new approach. Hayes tried it and scored 2 kills on his next engagement. He stopped objecting. By December 1943, 8 gunners in Parker's squadron were using the extreme lead deflection method. Their combined confirmed kills jumped from 9 in October to 41 in December. Squadron leadership took notice. The commander summoned Parker, inquiring whether he was teaching unauthorized gunnery techniques. Parker admitted it. The commander reviewed the statistics, looked at Parker, and said, "Keep doing it, but don't put anything in writing." The technique spread informally beyond Parker's squadron. Carrier airgroups rotated between ships. Gunners from different units spoke during liberty calls. A gunner from Parker's team would meet another from a different carrier in Sydney, and they shared tactics. Parker's method would be demonstrated. If it worked for the newcomer, he would teach his squadron. Aviation machinist first class James Wilson from VF-17 Fighting Squadron learned the technique in January 1944. Skeptical at first, he observed Parker demonstrate it during a joint exercise. Wilson returned to his squadron, and within 3 weeks, VF-17E's gunnery success rate doubled. When questioned, he explained, "The commander said he couldn't officially endorse an unapproved method, but would not prevent gunners from using it. This became the pattern. Official disapproval, unofficial adoption." The Navy doctrine stated one thing. Reality dictated another. Commanders prioritized results over procedure. If gunners were hitting more targets and losing fewer planes, methodology questions were secondary. By March 1944, the method reached at least 15 squadrons across 4 carriers. Gunners called it different things: extreme lead, future point shooting, the Parker method. No official designation existed because it had no formal recognition. Knowledge was passed informally, from experienced gunners to novices, taught in ready rooms and on flight decks, never mentioned in after-action reports or official training manuals. The adoption was organic. No formal instruction, no standardized program. Combat-proven results shared through the network of active shooters. It worked because those teaching it had survived using it when the old method might have killed them. Some units developed variations, leading by 12 aircraft lengths instead of 8, adjusting for altitude effects on bullet drop, estimating differently for head-on versus crossing shots. The core principle remained: aim where the target will be when the bullets arrive, not where it is now. By mid-1944, the technique had spread to squadrons in the Central and South Pacific and as far west as the Philippines. Japanese pilots noticed the change. By April, rear gunners, who had been easily evaded 6 months earlier, were now hitting with alarming precision. Intelligence reports indicated tracers appearing far ahead of aircraft in empty sky, then Zeros flying directly into them. The Imperial Japanese Navy assumed Americans had developed predictive gun technology, some kind of automated system calculating future positions. They couldn't fathom that gunners were simply aiming farther ahead manually. This misunderstanding led to flawed countermeasures. Pilots were instructed to maneuver unpredictably, change direction often, and vary speed radically. In practice, this made Zeros easier to hit, not harder. The timing was key. A sharp turn meant the Zero remained in that arc for at least a second due to physics and aircraft limits. American gunners using Parker's method could anticipate mid-turn positions. Aggressive maneuvering made the future path more predictable. Japanese tactics, including stern attacks, high-speed dives, and coordinated assaults, all failed against Parker's simple principle: estimate the target's future location and aim there. By summer 1944, Zero loss rates to American rear gunners had tripled compared to late 1943. Japanese intelligence noted the change, but misattributed it to non-existent predictive technology. Captured documents confirmed they continued teaching evasion tactics designed to confuse a non-existent computing system rather than the improved human judgment that had created the advantage. The simple truth: aim farther ahead. No computers, no fancy equipment, just better aiming and experience. Bomber losses fell from 10-15 in late 1943 to 3-5 by mid-1944. Part of that improvement came from better fighters escorting the bombers. Part came from declining Japanese pilot quality, as experienced aviators were killed faster than they could be replaced. But a significant portion came from rear gunners who were simply shooting more accurately. The fundamental problem for Japanese pilots was they were fighting an enemy they didn't understand. Parker's deflection shooting method didn't receive official recognition until after the war ended. The Navy conducted a comprehensive study of gunnery effectiveness in 1946. They analyzed combat reports from every carrier squadron in the Pacific. The data revealed that squadrons employing extreme lead deflection achieved triple the kill rate compared to units following standard doctrine. The analysis concluded that unofficial field adaptations to shooting technique had played a major role in securing American air superiority during the final 2 years of the conflict. By that stage, it was irrelevant. The approach had already been incorporated into operational practice throughout the fleet. Post-war gunnery instruction at Pensacola was quietly updated. Instructors began teaching wider lead angles, The official terminology became dynamic deflection shooting. The manual still did not reference Parker by name, but the procedures described mirrored exactly what he had pioneered over rabble in November 1943. The concepts extended beyond Navy gunners. Army Air Force tail gunners on B-17S and B-24S adopted similar tactics for engaging German fighters over Europe. The same principles applied. BF 109 seconds and FW 190 seconds executed aggressive maneuvers just like Zeros. Projectiles still required time to reach their targets. Aiming at predicted positions continued to outperform aiming at the current location. By early 1945, the method was standard across all American aerial gunner stations. The Korean War brought the tactic into the jet age. MiG-15 fighters were far faster than any World War II aircraft, requiring even more extreme lead distances. Gunners had to aim 15 to 20 aircraft lengths ahead, yet the core concept remained unchanged. Anticipate where the target would be, aim there, and fire. American gunners experienced with Zeros adapted the technique for combat against MiGs. During Vietnam, the challenges shifted. Helicopters replaced fighters, and ground fire replaced aerial engagements. Still, the deflection principle held. Door gunners targeting trucks along the Ho Chi Minh Trail applied extreme lead deflection, aiming at where the vehicle would be in 2 seconds, not where it was at that moment. Parker's method, developed 25 years earlier in a completely different war, remained relevant. Modern aerial warfare has largely removed human gunners. Fighter jets rely on radar-guided missiles, bombers employ electronic countermeasures, and the few remaining gun systems are computer-controlled. These computers calculate deflection automatically, lead angles, projectile velocity, and target speed. What Parker did intuitively in half a second is now executed by machines in milliseconds, but the underlying mathematics remains the same. Modern systems simply implement Parker's principle faster. Richard Parker survived the war. He completed 43 combat missions as a Corsair rear gunner, credited with 17 confirmed kills and 9 probables. He was promoted to aviation chief machinist, mate in January 1945, and awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross for his actions over rabble. The citation highlighted his exceptional gunnery accuracy but made no mention that he had developed a new method of shooting. After the war, Parker returned to Sacramento, California, working as an aviation mechanic for Pacific Airlines for 32 years. He married and had 2 daughters. He seldom discussed the war except with fellow veterans who understood. The deflection shooting technique he had created became so widespread that most gunners who used it never knew its origin, they only knew it worked. Parker passed away in 1991 at the age of 70. His obituary mentioned his Navy service, but did not note that thousands of American airmen had survived because of the method he discovered by aiming at empty sky. The principle he demonstrated over Rabble Harbor continues to influence how militaries approach engaging fast-moving targets, not through advanced technology, not through superior equipment, but through a better understanding of how projectiles and targets move through space and time. 17 confirmed kills, hundreds of gunners trained, thousands of lives spared, all because one machinist mate ignored the manual and trusted his own judgment about where the Zero would be, instead of where it was. If this story inspired you, hit the like button and subscribe for more untold World War II stories. We'd love to hear from you. Leave a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. Our community spans from Texas to Tasmania, from veterans to history enthusiasts. You're part of something special. Thank you for watching and for keeping these stories alive.